This episode is sponsored by Honeybadger. Are you looking to enhance clarity in production without a PhD in observability? Try Honeybadger Insights. Honeybadger Insights is built around structured events and Honeybadger's new query language BadgerQL, which allows you to analyze data, create metrics, and design custom dashboards. All of this is available for free with Honeybadger's monitoring suite, which includes error tracking, uptime monitoring, and more. Explore your data in new ways with BadgerQL. It's pretty cool and simple. So give it a try today at honeybadger.io. That's honeybadger.io. Back in episode 481, we covered the Kamal kitchen sink, which basically set up a complex deployment where we had multiple web servers, multiple job servers, deploying to a fully qualified domain name, and it had a lot of accessories. Some of those accessories were a load balancer, the Postgres database, and Minio for our file storage. However, there were a few things that were left out of this that I later found that was quite crucial to the process. And a little backstory behind this discovery: I was working at home, and I had my children in my office. They were being very loud, and it was quite distracting while I was working on a project with my oldest daughter. In one terminal, I had loaded up my development environment and I was in the Rails console, and in another environment, I had the production console open. Well, I'm sure you can see where this is going, but ultimately what happened was I ran a script that I thought I was running in the development environment, and it accidentally dropped a lot of records in the database of the app that I was building with my daughter. And so while it wasn't a critical application, it was still data loss, and it would have taken us a few hours to go back in and rekey all of that data. However, luckily, I did have good backups of that database. And because we didn't have data coming in very often, we were able to revert back to a previous backup, and the day was saved. However, that could have gone much worse in a different application that did have a lot of data coming in, or a situation where that data could not be recreated easily. And so in this episode, I want to look at when we do something like a Kamal console, it'll SSH us into that console, but then it'll also give us a production prompt. So no matter what I'm doing, I'm always going to see this production prompt. It'll hopefully be a red flag, so to speak, before I copy and paste something in there. And we'll also look at making it load in sandbox by default, just so we have a few extra measures of protection. And so we will start off with the code base from episode 481, so be sure to go back and watch that episode as well. We'll also look at, on that database server, deploying a Postgres backup, so we'll have our Postgres server running, and then we're also going to be using a library from Cartoza, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, called PG Backup, which will run an incremental backup on a schedule that we specify. And so with this application, I've not made any changes other than the IP addresses because my infrastructure has changed a bit since episode 481. However, all of this is pretty much the exact same, even down to the load balancer and everything. So I should be able to go to my domain and we can see that everything is working. And so to start off, I'm going to remove everything that I have in there just to make sure that it's starting fresh. And then, once all that's done, I can run the Kamal setup again just to redeploy everything. And this is just to get rid of all that prep work that I initially did. And so this is going to redeploy the load balancer, the database, Minio, the web servers, and also the background workers. Once that's all done, we can log back into Minio. I'll create the example bucket, which is what we had configured. We can then come back, create a post. We'll just give it a title. I'll take a snapshot. We'll paste this in here. We'll create the post, and everything should be fine. And so with that all working, if I were in my console to run the Kamal console, it's going to SSH into our container, and it'll take me into the Rails console. And one nice thing is that I do get this prod environment, but it's not very pronounced. I want to make sure that when I'm in here in the console, that I get a big alert that I'm in the production environment. I did cover this in a previous episode, in episode 415, so I'm not going to go through everything again. However, essentially what we can do is create a .irbrc file, and I'll paste in the contents from that episode. Essentially, what that looks like is we have a method for the Rails environment. If Rails is defined, then we're going to update the prompts. We'll do this for the different states that our prompt can be in, and then we'll set the prompt. And typically the irbrc file is going to live in the home directory of your user account. However, you could also have it at the project level for some project-specific configurations. And the only configuration difference that I did in this script from that episode is that I added this production prompt. And this is doing it on a background, so we'll have a background of red. But we can commit this, and then we can run the Kamal deploy to deploy this change. And after a minute, it should be deployed, and we can test out this new change with a Kamal console. And that again will launch up our Rails console, and now we have this nice production prompt. So no matter what we're doing, if we are getting a lot of records, we should always see this bright red prompt as just a reminder that we are in the production environment. However, this is still pretty dangerous and destructive. So that Kamal console command, if we go under our config and the deploy.yaml file, let's have a look to see how that's configured. So I'll scroll up where those aliases are, and that is a feature from Kamal 2. And we can see this console command is running it on the app. We're doing an interactive use and running the command binrails console. So on here, I want to add a -- sandbox. So that way when we run the Kamal console, it'll by default run it in sandbox mode. And we can go ahead and test this out with a Kamal console. Notice I didn't make the commit and redeploy this yet, and we don't have to do that when we are making changes within this deploy YAML file, because we're not depending on code being on the server. Instead, we are just executing a command. And so now you'll see that we are loading the production environment in sandbox mode. And this is nice because any modifications we make will be rolled back. So for example, if I did a post.all, we'll see we have our one post. I'll grab the first one and we'll destroy it. So now when we call the post.all, we don't have any posts. However, if we come back to our console and refresh the page, we do still have that post. As soon as we exit the console, those changes are rolled back and nothing was persisted. And I prefer this because if there are any kind of changes that we have to run in our production console that's going to mutate data or change or delete any kind of records, then that should be something that's done in a release cycle through a rake task. The only time we should really be using the console is if we need to do any kind of investigative work. If there is a bug reported that we're trying to troubleshoot, then there's no reason why we need a full interactive console. A sandbox environment should suffice. And so just as a safety precaution, having it run in sandbox mode by default, I think is a warranted change. And so now we get into the database backups. But because we are basically deploying Docker containers, we can just simply deploy another Docker container. And I'm going to call this one the Postgres_backup. And we're going to use an image. We'll use it from Cartoza /pg-backup. And then we need to select the version. I do recommend going to the Docker Hub just to find the specific version that you need. However, because I'm using PostgreSQL version 17, as we can see on line 107, I do need to use the 17 major version as well of the PG backup. But then we need to select the minor and patch version, which I found 3.5 worked. We can deploy this on any one of our applications. However, I'm just going to put it on the same database server, but you could spin up a whole different VM for this if you wanted to. We do need to have some environment variables. With a clear, we'll have our Postgres_user, and I'll fill out the values in just a moment. We'll have the Postgres_database or DB. We'll have the Postgres_host, the Postgres_port, and then also a cron_schedule. We're also going to need a secret, and we had the Postgres_password, but I found that upon inspecting this image, it needs to be the Postgres_pass. So that does mean we do need to come up in the Kamal secrets, and I'm just going to duplicate the Postgres password, and I'm going to change it to Postgres pass. So we do have a bit of code duplication here, but I'm okay with it because it's pretty clear what this is doing. And we can always do a code search to find out where those are being used. But for the username, I'm basically just going to copy the same information that we have on the Postgres server, and I can't just copy the Postgres for the host. That does need to be a little bit different because if we SSH into that server, and if we run a Docker container ls, we'll see that the actual name is our application name dash and then the Postgres. So I actually want to call it the example-postgres. And for the cron schedule, it is important to note that this backup script is going to back up once a day. So if I do set it for something like every minute, then it's just going to keep overriding, which that might be okay. So maybe you want it to back up every 10 minutes, and that's fine. However, if you are working with a very large data set that takes 20 minutes to back up, then having it back up every 10 minutes could be a problem. So you want to make sure that you're adjusting this based on your situation. But finally, we need to set up the directories. And this is simply where we're going to be storing the backups. So I'm just going to call it the backups, and it needs to mount to the folder backups. And that's going to be at the root directory. But now that's pretty much good to go. And so we can go ahead and deploy this with the Kamal accessory boot. And then we want to boot the Postgres _ backup. That'll create the new Docker container accessory on the server that we specified. And do take note, one thing here is that we did have this Docker run command and it passed in all of our information here with the environment variables and everything. So if I were to change this, we'll just say the host to a different IP address. And if we call the Kamal accessory restart the Postgres backup, then when this runs, we wanted to also update that new host. But what you'll find that it's just going to stop the container and then start it. It's not actually updating any of these environment variables. So instead of a restart, we do need to run the reboot. And rebooting it will still stop the container, but when it goes to start it up again, we see that it stops, and then it's running it again, and it's then going to use the updated host. So we can run the Kamal accessory just to see what other options there are. We are able to call logs, so let's go ahead and get the logs. We'll add the -f to follow, and we want to follow the Postgres _ backup. Oh, and apparently we can't add the -f, so let's just run with the Postgres backup, and we see that the script is running, and we didn't get any connection errors. So that's great. That means that it's going to start backing up to that server. We can verify that with shelling in to that server. We can list out. We do have a new folder for the backup. We can cd into that folder. There's a folder called backups. And looking into here, we see that we have the current year, December, and within here, we have our initial backup. So that's going to run every 10 minutes. And then we can always extract these databases and restore them as we need. And so while I think Rails does provide us some really good defaults, I do think that it is important to take a few extra precautions with our database backups and with our interactive shells to not only have that visual warning, but to also protect ourselves by putting it in sandbox mode. Because again, any kind of mutation of records really should be done in a rate task, not within the console, even if it is a very trivial change. Well, that's all for this episode. Thanks for watching. For more videos, check out driftandruby.com.